Evening, friends. The fire's burning low tonight. Settle in wherever you are. Let the warmth reach you. Let the quiet do what quiet does best. I always enjoy hearing where folks are listening from. If you'd like, leave a comment and tell me which part of the world you're resting in tonight. And if these quiet Western evenings help you unwind, you're always welcome to subscribe and come sit by the fire again. Now then, I was thinking just a moment ago, watching these last coals shift and glow, about a particular winter evening back in '91. January, I believe it was, though don't hold me to the exact date. What I remember clearly is the cold and the quiet, and the way the jail felt when both cells stood empty and the stove was the only thing in the building with anything to say. I was deputy in Cottonwood Creek by then. Had been for a good stretch of years already, long enough that the routines of the job had worn themselves into my bones, the way water wears a groove into stone. You do something every day for enough years, and it stops being a task. It becomes part of how you move through the world. Checking the cells was like that for me. Didn't matter if someone was in them or not. I checked them just the same. That particular January had been brutal. Cold settled over the territory sometime around Christmas and never lifted. The kind of cold that doesn't announce itself with wind or bluster. It just arrives, sits down, stays. The air outside was so still you could hear a pin oak creak from 2 streets over. Frost built up on the inside of window panes, not just the outside, and the mud on Main Street froze into hard ridges that could turn an ankle if you weren't watchful where you stepped. Most folks stayed indoors after sundown. You'd see the glow of lamps behind curtains up and down the street, a kind of amber warmth pressed into rectangles against all that gray and dark. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin, straight columns because there was no breeze to bend them, just smoke going up and cold coming down, and the whole town tucked tight beneath it like a quilt pulled over sleeping shoulders. I had spent the afternoon at the office, which is what we called the front room of the jail. It was a modest building, Cottonwood Creek's jail. Single story, adobe walls about 2 feet thick, which kept it tolerable in summer and held the stove heat decent enough in winter, though you had to feed that stove steady or the cold would start creeping in from the corners, like something alive. The front room had my desk, a chair with one arm that wobbled if you leaned wrong, a gun rack on the wall that held 2 rifles and a shotgun, and a row of wooden pegs near the door where I hung my coat and hat. Behind the front room, to a doorway with no door. The door had come off its hinges years before I ever took the post, and nobody had seen fit to replace it, were the 2 cells, side by side. Iron bars running floor to ceiling, each cell about 8 feet deep and maybe 6 feet wide. A narrow cot in each one, bolted to the wall, a thin wool blanket folded at the foot, a bucket in the corner. That was the whole of it. Not much to look at, not much to tend, but I tended it anyway. Sheriff Callahan had gone home around 4 o'clock that afternoon. He lived just past the feed store with his wife Margaret and their daughter, who was maybe 9 or 10 at the time. A quiet family. Callahan was a calm man. Didn't raise his voice much. Didn't need to. He had a way of looking at a situation that made things settle down on their own. I respected him, learned a great deal from the way he handled his duties, which was mostly by not handling them harder than they needed to be handled. When he left that afternoon, he'd said what he usually said. "Keep the stove going, Henry. I'll see you in the morning." And I'd said what I usually said. "Yes, sir. Evening, Sheriff." And then I was alone. Now, being alone in a Cottonwood Creek jail on a cold January evening was not an unpleasant thing. I want you to understand that. There's a particular kind of comfort that comes from being in a sturdy building with a warm stove when the world outside is frozen still. The walls held the heat. The stove ticked and popped as the iron expanded. The lamp on my desk threw a circle of gold across the papers and the inkwell and the ledger book where I kept my daily notes. I sat for a while at that desk, writing in the ledger. My handwriting was never what you'd call elegant, but I was thorough. Every entry, every day, the date, the weather, who came and went, what business, if any, was conducted. Most days in Cottonwood Creek, the entries were short, cold and clear, no incidents, stove-fed at regular intervals, rounds completed, that sort of thing. Some men might have found the recording of uneventful days to be a waste of ink. I never did. There's something honest about writing down that nothing happened. It means the town was at peace. And peace, I have learned over a long life, is not nothing. It is the most valuable something there is. I finished my entry for the day and set the pen down, blew on the ink to dry it, though in that cold air it dried quick enough on its own, closed the ledger, sat back in my chair, and listened. The stove, the faint settle of the building. Somewhere, far off, maybe a quarter mile or more, a dog barked twice and then went silent. That was all. The whole world compressed down to the sounds a building makes when it's holding itself against the cold. After a while, I stood up, not because anything called me to stand, not because there was a duty waiting, just because my legs had been still long enough and the habit of moving through the building was stronger than the comfort of sitting. I took the lamp from the desk and carried it with me through the doorway into the back where the cells were. The lamplight moved ahead of me and filled the narrow corridor with soft, shifting gold. Shadows swung along the walls, my own shadow largest among them, stretched and bent by the angle of the flame. The iron bars caught the light and threw it back in thin, bright lines that moved as I moved, like something living inside the metal. Both cell doors stood open. Had been open for weeks. We hadn't had a prisoner since early December, when old Gus Parnell had spent 2 nights inside after an altercation at the saloon that amounted to nothing more than harsh words and a knocked-over table. Gus was 70-some years old and mostly harmless. He'd slept both nights through without a word of complaint, eaten the meals I brought him from the boarding house kitchen, and walked out on the morning of the 3rd day with a tip of his hat and a quiet, "Much obliged, deputy." That was the last soul to occupy either of those cells. But I checked them just the same. I stepped into the first cell, the one on the left. My boots made a soft sound on the stone floor, a kind of gritty whisper, because dust collected in there no matter how often I swept. I held the lamp up and let the light fill the small space. The cot, the blanket, the bucket, the walls, which were the same adobe as the rest of the building, smooth and cool to the touch. I ran my hand along the iron bars, out of habit, not checking for weakness, not looking for damage. just touching them. The way you might run your hand along a fence you've walked past 1,000 times. The iron was cold, always cold in winter. It held the temperature of the air around it and gave nothing back. The blanket on the cot had shifted since the last time I'd been in here. Not much. Just a corner folded under, probably from when I'd swept 2 days prior and bumped the cot with a broom handle. I set the lamp on the floor, bent down, and straightened the blanket, smoothed it flat, tucked the edges so they hung even on both sides. It was a thin blanket, gray wool, rough to the touch, not the kind of blanket you'd want on your own bed. But it was clean, and it was whole, and if someone needed to sleep under it, it would do its job well enough. I picked up the lamp and stood there a moment longer, just standing in that empty cell, listening to the quiet. There was a particular quality to the silence inside those iron bars. The rest of the building had its sounds. The stove, the creak of the front door if the wind shifted, the occasional tap of a tree branch against the west wall. But inside the cell, with 3 walls of adobe and 1 wall of iron, the sound narrowed down to almost nothing. Just your own breathing, the faint hiss of the lamp, the small, patient tick of cold air settling against stone. I have stood in a great many quiet places in my life, friends. Stood on ridgelines at dawn, where the only sound was wind moving across sage. Stood beside rivers, so still they looked like poured glass. Stood on the porch of this very cabin where I sit tonight, listening to the stars, if you can call it that. That deep, wide silence that comes when the sky is clear and the land is resting. But the quiet inside an empty jail cell has its own character. It's a held quiet, a waiting quiet. The room was built to contain a person, and when there's no person to contain, it contains the silence instead, holds it close, keeps it. I stepped out of the first cell and into the second. The one on the right was identical in every respect, which I suppose is the nature of jail cells. They're not built for individuality. Same cot, same blanket, same bucket, same stone floor with the same fine layer of dust. I set the lamp down again and went through the same motions. Hand along the bars, blanket straightened, corners tucked. I checked the bucket, which was dry and clean. I'd scrubbed both of them the week before, more out of a need for something to do with my hands than any practical necessity. The hinges on the second cell door had developed a slight creak. Not loud, just a small, dry sound, like 2 fingertips rubbed together. I made a note in my mind to oil them in the morning. It's a strange thing, oiling the hinges on a door that nobody needs opened or closed. But a hinge left to rust will seize up eventually, and then when you do need it, it won't give. That's the nature of maintenance. You do it when it's not needed, so it's ready when it is. I carried the lamp back out to the front room and set it on the desk. The stove needed feeding. I could tell by the sound of it. The fire had burned down from its steady crackle to a lower, slower tick, the kind of sound a stove makes when the coals are still hot, but the fuel is running thin. I opened the iron door, felt the push of warmth against my face, and laid in 2 splits of piñón. The wood was dry and seasoned. It caught quick. The flames wrapped around the fresh fuel, and the stove began to sing again. that low, satisfied hum of iron and fire doing what they were made to do. I stood by the stove for a while with my hands out, palms open to the heat. My fingers had gone stiff from the cold back in the cells. The warmth soaked into them slow, starting at the skin and working inward, and I curled and uncurled my fingers a few times just to feel the motion coming back easy. Through the front window, I could see a portion of Main Street. Not much. The window was small, and the frost on the glass blurred everything beyond a few dozen yards. But I could make out the shape of the general store across the way, its front porch dark, its sign unreadable in the gloom. A lamp burned in the upstairs window of the building next to it, which was Hargrove's place. Old Hargrove stayed up late most nights. I never knew what he did up there at that hour. Read? Maybe. Or just sat with his lamp and his thoughts the way old men do, when sleep becomes a thing you have to wait for, rather than a thing that comes when called. I thought about stepping outside to walk the street. It was part of my evening routine. A slow patrol up one side of Main Street and down the other, checking door latches, peering into alleys, making sure the town was buttoned up proper for the night. But the cold gave me pause. I could feel it pressed against the walls of the building, patient and heavy. And I knew that the moment I opened that front door, it would pour in like water through a broken dam. Still, the routine was the routine. I pulled my coat from the peg by the door. Heavy wool, dark brown, lined with a layer of cotton batting that Margaret Callahan had sewn in for me the previous winter as a kindness. It was the warmest coat I'd ever owned. I buttoned it to the neck, turned the collar up, and set my hat on my head. Pulled on my gloves, which were leather, cracked at the fingers from years of use but still serviceable. Took a breath, opened the door. The cold hit my face the way a flat hand hits a table. Direct. Total. No negotiation. The air was so sharp, it felt like breathing in ground glass for the first few seconds until my lungs adjusted and the breathing became just breathing again, only colder. My eyes watered. The moisture froze almost immediately on my lashes, and I blinked it away. Main Street stretched out before me, empty and pale under a sky that was more felt than seen. No moon that I could find. The stars were there, but hazy, dimmed by a thin sheet of high cloud that turned the sky into a gray-white vault. The buildings on either side of the street stood dark and still, their shapes familiar even in the half-light. The general store, the feed store, the barber shop, the saloon with its painted sign hanging motionless in the dead air. The boardwalk ran along both sides of the street, planks laid over mud, and the wood was furred with frost that made each step a careful thing. I started on the east side and walked north. My boots were loud in the silence. Each step made the boardwalk creak and groan beneath me, the cold having tightened the wood so that every plank spoke when weighted. I kept my pace slow. There was no reason to hurry, no one waiting for me at the end of the walk, no one expecting a report. This was just me and the town, and the cold and the dark, moving through each other the way we'd moved through each other 100 nights before. The general store was locked. I checked the front door by pressing my gloved hand against it and giving a gentle push. Solid. The latch held. Through the window I could see the shapes of shelves and barrels, the dim outlines of goods stacked and sorted. Clem Howell ran that store with a quiet efficiency that I admired. Everything in its place. Everything accounted for. He swept the floor every evening before closing and left the counters wiped clean. Even in the dark, through frost-dimmed glass, you could tell it was a well-kept place. I moved on, past the barber shop, which had been closed since 3 that afternoon. The striped pole out front was barely visible, just a suggestion of red and white in the darkness. The door was latched. I pressed it, held, moved on. The saloon was next. Now, the saloon in Cottonwood Creek was not the raucous, brawling sort of establishment you might picture when you hear that word. It was a quiet place, as saloons go, run by a man named Dunnigan, who kept order with a steady hand and a policy of cutting off any man who'd had more than was good for him. There was a piano in the corner, but it was played softly, and not every night. Most evenings, the saloon was a place where men sat at tables and talked low over whiskey or beer, or played cards without any particular stakes, or simply sat alone and watched the room the way men do when they're tired and not ready to go home to an empty house. By this hour, though, it must have been close to 9 o'clock. Even the saloon was near empty. I could see through the front window that only 2 lamps still burned inside. Dunnigan himself was probably behind the bar, wiping glasses, waiting for the last few souls to finish their drinks and head home. I didn't go in, just checked the side door, which opened onto the alley, and found it latched from the inside, gave the front door a look, and saw no cause for concern. Moved on. The feed store, the saddlery, the assay office, which had been closed for months and sat dark and patient at the north end of the street, its windows dusty, its sign faded. I checked each door, each latch, not because I expected to find any of them disturbed. I checked them because checking them was what I did, and doing what you do in the order you do it is the thread that holds the days together. At the north end of Main Street, the boardwalk ended, and the road turned to open ground that led out toward the hills. I stood there for a moment, hands deep in my coat pockets, and looked north. The land beyond town was a darker darkness, rolling and vast, the shapes of low hills barely distinguishable from the sky. Somewhere out there, miles and miles of open territory stretched in every direction. Grassland and scrub and frozen creek beds, and the distant unseen mountains that ringed the valley like the walls of a room too large to comprehend. In summer, you could see those mountains clear, blue and jagged against the sky. In winter, they disappeared, just folded into the gray and were gone. The cold was working its way through my coat by then. Not fast. The coat was good, but steady, the way cold always works. Patient, persistent, finding the seams and the gaps and the places where the fabric pulled thin. My ears burned. The tip of my nose had gone numb. I turned and started back down the west side of the street. The west side had fewer businesses and more residences. Small houses set back from the boardwalk, some with picket fences, some without. Most were dark. A few had lamps burning in their front rooms, the light leaking out through curtains in soft, warm bands. I walked past them, slow, not looking in. A man doesn't look into another person's windows at night, not unless he's got cause, but aware of the light and grateful for it. Each lit window was a small declaration that someone was awake, someone was warm, someone was going about the small business of their evening. reading, mending, talking quietly, or just sitting near their own stove, the way I'd been sitting near mine an hour before. Halfway down the west side, I passed the carpenter shop, Tom Adler's place. Tom was a big, slow-moving man with hands like shovels and a disposition as gentle as Sunday morning. He built everything in Cottonwood Creek that needed building: shelves, coffins, porches, wagon beds, cradles. His shop smelled of pine shavings and linseed oil, and even in winter, even walking past the closed door, you could catch a faint trace of that smell if you breathed deep enough. I did. Just a whisper of it, piney and clean, carried on the frozen air. The church sat at the far south end of the west side, a small building, whitewashed, with a steeple that leaned slightly to the east from years of wind. The Reverend Mrs. Patterson. We called her that because her husband had been the Reverend before her, and she'd simply carried on after he passed, kept the church tidy and the bell polished, though the bell hadn't been rung in some time on account of a crack that had developed in the cold. She'd sent away to have a new one cast, but these things took time. Months. Sometimes. Meanwhile, she called the congregation to Sunday services by standing on the front step and ringing a handbell, which worked well enough for a town the size of Cottonwood Creek. I checked the church door. Latched. The stained glass window above the entrance was dark, just colored shapes without the light behind them to bring them alive. In the daytime, when the sun came through, that window threw patches of blue and red and gold across the floor of the church in patterns that shifted as the hours passed. But at night, it was just glass, dark glass holding back the dark. I completed my circuit and found myself back at the jail. The walk had taken perhaps 20 minutes, though it felt both longer and shorter than that, the way time behaves when you're alone and moving through familiar ground in the dark. I pushed open the door, and the warmth of the stove reached out and wrapped itself around me like a hand pulling me inside. I stepped in, closed the door, and stood still for a moment, letting the heat find all the cold places on my body and begin its slow work of reclamation. I hung my coat, removed my hat, pulled off my gloves, and set them on the desk to dry. My fingers were white at the tips and slow to bend. I held them near the stove and waited. The lamp still burned on the desk. The ledger still sat where I'd left it. Everything in the room was exactly as it had been before I'd stepped out, which is the nature of rooms that have no one in them. They hold their shape with a kind of stubborn fidelity, waiting for the next person to come along and disturb the arrangement of things. I sat down at the desk, opened the ledger, took up the pen, added a line to the day's entry. Evening patrol completed. All doors secured. No disturbances. Temperature well below freezing. Street deserted. Both cells inspected and in order. In order. I wrote that phrase often. It meant everything was where it should be, doing what it should be doing, or in the case of the cells, not doing anything at all, just being empty in the way they were supposed to be empty when no one needed containing. There's a kind of order in emptiness, a readiness. The cells were not neglected. They were waiting, and I tended them while they waited, because that's what a deputy does. I set the pen down and leaned back. The chair creaked. I looked at the ceiling, which was low, made of rough sawn planks darkened by years of stove smoke. A cobweb hung in the far corner, fine as thread, moving in a draft I couldn't feel. I watched it sway, a tiny, patient motion, back and forth, back and forth. No spider in it, just the web, doing what it did in the absence of the creature that had made it. My mind drifted, the way minds do when the body is warm and still and the world outside is gone quiet. I thought about the cells, about all the men who'd occupied them over the years. Not many, truth be told. Cottonwood Creek was a peaceable town. We had our moments, sure. A disagreement here, a misunderstanding there, the occasional bout of overindulgence that led to poor judgment. But for the most part, those cells sat empty, which suited me fine. An empty cell meant the town was behaving, meant people were getting along, or at least keeping their disagreements to a volume and intensity that didn't require my involvement. I thought about Gus Parnell, the last man to sleep in cell number 1. Old Gus, with his white whiskers and his shuffling gait and his tendency to get emotional about matters of no particular consequence after his third whiskey. The altercation that had landed him in the cell was over a game of dominoes. Gus had accused Wilbur Fry of cheating, which Wilbur almost certainly was not doing. And the accusation had led to raised voices, which had led to a table being knocked sideways, which had sent a bottle of whiskey to the floor, where it shattered in a spray of glass and spirits that Dunnigan was still annoyed about 2 weeks later. No blows were struck, no threats made beyond the vague. Gus had simply gotten himself worked up past the point where reason could call him back, and the kindest thing to do was give him a quiet place to sit until the whiskey wore off and the morning light reminded him that dominoes were not worth losing your composure over. He'd slept like a child both nights, snored in fact, with a regularity and volume that I could hear from the front room. And when he left on the third morning, he'd paused at the door and said, "That cot's not bad, Henry. Better than my bed at home, if I'm honest." Then he'd put on his hat and walked out into the December sunshine. And that was the end of it. I smiled, sitting there at my desk, thinking about old Gus. Then I thought about the blankets I'd just straightened, the thin gray wool, tucked neat on cots that no one was using. I'd smoothed them flat and folded the corners, and I couldn't rightly say why it mattered to me that they lay just so. Nobody was going to see them. Nobody was going to sleep under them tonight. But there's a thing about tending to spaces that holds true whether or not they're occupied. When you care for a place, sweep its floor, oil its hinges, straighten its blankets, you're saying something. You're saying this place matters. Someone might need it, and when they do, it'll be ready. I think about that now, sitting here by this fire, an old man with more years behind me than ahead. The habits I built in that jail have stayed with me. I still check things, still make sure the cabin door is latched before I sleep, still fold the blanket at the foot of my bed just so, still walk the property in the evening even when there's nothing to check and no one to report to. The routine persists because the routine is the shape of the days. And without shape, the days are just hours falling into hours, with nothing to hold them apart. But I was telling you about that night in January, about the cells, and the stove, and the cold. After I'd finished my ledger entry and sat a while by the stove, I got up and went back to the cells one more time. I don't know what drew me. There was no reason to go back there. I'd already checked everything. already straightened the blankets and tested the bars and made my mental note about the creaky hinge. But something in me wanted to stand in that quiet space again. So I took the lamp and walked back through the doorway. The cells looked the same, of course. They hadn't changed in the 20 minutes since I'd left them. The blankets lay flat on the cots. The buckets sat clean in their corners. The iron bars stood straight and cold, catching the lamplight the same way they'd caught it before. I set the lamp on the floor outside the cells and leaned against the wall of the corridor. The adobe was cool against my shoulder. Even through my shirt, I crossed my arms and stood there. Why do we tend to empty spaces? I've asked myself that question many times over the years, and I've never arrived at a satisfying answer. Maybe it's because the tendon itself is the point, not the result. Not whether anyone notices or benefits. Just the act of caring for a thing that exists in your charge. The cells were my responsibility. Same as the stove. Same as the ledger. Same as the locks on every door along Main Street. They were part of the job, and the job was part of me. And I did it whether it was needed or not, because the doing of it was how I knew I was still here, still present, still paying attention to the world around me. The stove ticked in the front room. I could hear it from where I stood, faint but steady, like the pulse of the building. The piñon I'd fed it earlier would burn for another hour or so before it needed more. I'd feed it again before I settled in for the night. I kept a cot of my own in the front room. Not as narrow as the cell cots, but not much wider, where I slept on nights when I pulled the late watch. Which was most nights, truth be told. I didn't mind. Sleeping in the jail had its comforts. The stove, the solidness of the walls, the knowledge that I was right where I was supposed to be. I stood there in the corridor between the cells for longer than I probably should have. 5 minutes, maybe 10, just leaning against the wall, arms crossed, letting my thoughts wander the way smoke wanders from a chimney on a windless night, straight up for a while, then curling, spreading, drifting off in one direction or another without any particular intent. I thought about the town, about how it looked in summer, when the cottonwood trees that gave the creek its name were full and green, and the leaves made a sound in the breeze like running water. About how it looked in autumn, when those same leaves turned gold and fell in slow spirals to the ground and collected in drifts along the boardwalk that I'd sweep away each morning, only to find new ones gathered by afternoon. About how it looked in spring, when the mud was deep and the wildflowers came up on the hillsides in patches of yellow and purple, and the creek ran high with snowmelt from the mountains. And about how it looked now, in winter, stripped down, quiet, the trees bare, the ground frozen, the sky low and gray. Cottonwood Creek in winter was not a pretty place, not in the way most folks mean when they say pretty, but it had a kind of beauty all the same. The beauty of endurance, of a place that holds together through the hard months and waits for the easy ones to come back around. I picked up the lamp and walked back to the front room, fed the stove, sat at the desk one last time, and read over the day's ledger entry. Satisfied, I closed the book and pushed it to the corner of the desk where it always sat, took off my boots and set them beside the cot, loosened my collar, turned the lamp down low, but didn't extinguish it. I liked a small flame burning through the night, just enough to see by if I woke. I lay down on the cot and pulled the blanket up. It was thicker than the ones in the cells, a proper quilt that Mrs. Patterson had donated to the jail after her husband passed, saying it was too fine to sit folded in a cedar chest when it could be keeping someone warm. I'd thanked her for it and meant it every cold night. I thought kindly of her for that gift. The ceiling above me was low enough that if I raised my arm, I could press my palm flat against the planks. I didn't. Just lay there, hands at my sides, and listened to the stove and the building and the silence beyond the walls. Outside, the cold continued its work. I could hear the faint snap and pop of wood contracting in the freeze, the boardwalk, the porch posts, the frame of the building itself, all tightening incrementally as the temperature dropped further. Tiny sounds, the kind you only hear when everything else has gone to rest. I thought about the cells again, about the blankets I'd smoothed, the bars I'd touched, the hinges I'd noted for oilin', small things, the smallest things in the world, but they were mine to tend, and I had tended them. And now the day was done, and the night was deep, and the town was safe, and the stove was warm, and the cells were empty and clean and ready for whatever the next day might ask of them. That's a good way to end a day, friends, knowing that the things in your care are in order, not because anyone will check, not because anyone will notice, but because the tendon is its own reward. The act of showing up and doing the small things that hold the bigger things together. I closed my eyes. The stove settled. The lamp flickered low. The cold outside pressed close to the walls, but could not get in. And I slept. But before I did, and this is the part I remember most clearly, all these years later, I heard something, a small sound from far away. So far, it was almost below the level of hearing. A train whistle, miles off, maybe 10, maybe more, carried on the frozen air with that strange clarity that extreme cold gives to distant sounds. Just one long, low note, drawn out across the night, fading as it traveled. A train passing through the territory on its way to somewhere else, not stopping at Cottonwood Creek. We didn't have a rail stop. The nearest one was over in Ridgewater, a half-day's ride east. But on cold nights, when the air was still and heavy, the sound of those trains carried across the distance like a voice calling from another room. I lay there and listened to it fade. A long, slow fade, the note growing thinner and thinner until it was just a memory of a sound, and then not even that. Just silence again. Pure, complete, winter silence. And I thought, someone is on that train. Someone is moving through this cold night, headed somewhere. Maybe home, maybe away from home, maybe to a place they've never been, carrying nothing but a suitcase and a hope and the faith that wherever the rails lead will be better than wherever they left. And here I am, in Cottonwood Creek, in this jail with its warm stove and its empty cells and its oiled hinges and its straightened blankets, not going anywhere, not needing to. There's a peace in that, friends, in being still while the world moves, in being the one who stays. I was not a man of grand ambitions. Never wanted to be sheriff, never wanted to be mayor or judge or any of the titles that carry weight and expectation. I wanted to be useful. I wanted to tend to the things that needed tending. And Cottonwood Creek gave me that. Gave me a place to belong and a purpose to fill and a routine that kept the days shaped and the nights manageable. I did not know it then. You rarely know these things while they're happening. But that winter was one of the coldest on record in the territory. Folks talked about it for years afterward. The winter of '91, they'd say, with that particular tone people use when remembering something. Pipes froze, stocks suffered, the creek iced over so solid you could walk across it, and some of the children did, sliding and laughing on the surface while their mothers watched from the bank with worry in their eyes and cold in their bones. But in the jail, the stove held. The walls held. The building that the town had put up years before I ever arrived did exactly what it was supposed to do. Kept the inside warm and the outside out. Sheltered whatever needed sheltering. Whether that was a prisoner or a deputy or just two empty cells waiting for nobody at all. I remember waking the next morning. The lamp had burned out sometime in the night, and the room was lit only by the faint gray light coming through the frost-covered window. The stove had burned low, but not out. I could hear the coals still ticking, holding their heat beneath a layer of ash. I lay there for a moment, warm under Mrs. Patterson's quilt, and listened. The town was waking up. I could hear it in small, scattered sounds. A door closing somewhere down the street, the scrape of a shovel against a frozen porch step, the thin creak of a wagon wheel that needed greasing. Normal sounds. The sounds of people starting their day the way they always started their day, with the small necessities of living that don't change no matter how cold it gets or how hard the winter bears down. I swung my legs off the cot and set my feet on the floor. The stone was cold through my socks, and I reached for my boots quick, pulled them on, stood, stretched. My back was stiff from the cot, the way it always was. I went to the stove, opened the door, stirred the coals with the poker, laid in fresh wood. The fire caught. The stove began to warm. The room began to warm, and the day began. I went through the doorway to check the cells, force of habit. Both still empty. Both blankets still smooth and flat, exactly as I'd left them. The bucket in each corner, the bars cold and straight. The hinge on cell 2 still needing oil. I'd get to that after breakfast. Everything in order. I walked back to the desk, opened the ledger, and began a new entry. The date, the weather, the state of things. I wrote carefully, the pen scratching soft against the paper, the ink dark and slow in the cold air. January the something, 1891. Clear and cold. Stove held through the night, both cells empty and in order. Hinge on cell 2 to be oiled today. Town quiet. Day beginning. That's how it was, friends. That's how most days were. No great event. No crisis. No story that would make the newspapers or the history books. Just a man in a small town, tending to his duties, moving through the hours with care and attention, keeping the small things in order so the bigger things could hold. I know that doesn't sound like much. A deputy checking empty cells and straightening blankets nobody's gonna sleep under. Walking a frozen street to push on doors that are already locked. Writing in a ledger that maybe no one will ever read. It doesn't sound like the kind of evening worth remembering, let alone worth telling about all these decades later, beside a campfire that's burning lower with every minute. But I'll tell you this, those quiet evenings taught me something that the loud ones never could. They taught me that the value of a day is not measured by what happens in it, It's measured by the care you bring to it, the attention, the willingness to show up and do the small work without expectation of notice or reward. That's the whole of it. That's the lesson. If there is one, though I promised myself long ago that I would not preach or teach, only remember, so I remember. I remember the cold, the lamplight, the iron bars, the thin gray blankets, smooth and flat, the stove ticking in the front room, the train whistle, far off, fading into nothing, the silence that came after, and I remember the peace, the deep, still, winter peace of a night when nothing happened, and nothing needed to happen, and the town slept safe, and the cells were empty and clean, and the stove was warm, and I was exactly where I was supposed to be. That's enough for tonight, I think. The fire here's almost down to embers, and the air's got that soft coolness to it that tells me it's time to let the night have its way. I'm grateful you sat with me a while. These old memories don't ask much, just a quiet ear and a willing heart. If you enjoyed this evening together, you're always welcome back. I'll be here. Same fire, same place. Cottonwood Creek hasn't gone anywhere, and neither have I. Rest well now. Wherever you are, let the quiet settle in. Let the warmth find you. And I'll see you next time. The fire's burning low.